Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Learn with Lorna. I'm just going to wait for a second for people to join us. So yeah, welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. Before we go any further, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to watch any of the Learn with Lorna films. So at no point should you be paying or subscribing for anything at all. If you are in a position to be able to donate towards the work of the Highland Archive Service, we would really appreciate that. There's a link in this post to be able to do so. And I wanted to open as well by thanking everyone who's donated so far. It's really so much appreciated. You'll see the huge range of collections that we care for and the huge range of things that we do with them, and donations enable us to carry on with that work. So it's very much appreciated. Crikey, we've been going for 1 minute and there's already 113 people on. So it's lovely to see all the hellos coming in from Skye, Australia, Glasgow, places. Adrich, Dornach, yes, it's miserable in Inverness as well, I can tell you. So hello, it's lovely to have you all with us. I am trying for the first time live captions, so forgive me if those come up with anything that doesn't sound like what I'm saying. It doesn't look like what I'm saying, but it's a trial to see if that's of help to some people watching. I've done a previous session on the asylum records, which some of you may have watched and been involved in. That was on the 23rd of July. If you haven't seen that and would like to go back and watch it, then please do go back. All the previous films, this is the 27th of this series, all the previous ones are available on our Facebook page and on the High Life Highland YouTube channel. And again, there's a link to that in this post. So if you want to go back and watch that or any other ones, then please do so. It's still so nice seeing everybody's hellos still coming in. It seems to be miserable weather absolutely everywhere except Erskine. So the previous session looked at the history of the building, the development of the asylum system, and a couple of short stories of patients. So for more on that, then please do go back and have a look at that first film. All I'm going to say on the history of the building for today's one is that the asylum opened in 1864. It was the third district asylum to be opened in Scotland, and that's really the only fact about the building and the institution that I'm going to put into this week's talk, just because it gives you a little bit of context on the time we're talking about. So this week, by request of quite a lot of people, I'm going to be looking a little bit more at some of the stories of people who spent time in the asylum. This is an extensive collection of records. There are 8 enormous admission registers. In addition to that, there are a wide range of other types of documents, other types of admissions and other information, and 88 volumes of case notes. And when I say volumes, they are not the size of the books behind me. These are enormous, thick, packed volumes of information. There are staffing records. There are a wide range of other types of information within this collection. They show very much the range of people who went into the asylum, the range of backgrounds that people came from, and the range of ages of people who went in. The youngest that I have seen, and there may be others, but certainly the youngest that I have seen so far was aged 14. To my mind, this emphasises something that we now know and accept quite easily, which is that mental health problems can affect anyone. They can affect people of any age, of any background, and at any stage of their life. So you may go through life with no problems and then suddenly be hit with something. And that very much comes across in these records. And something I want to be absolutely clear about, as I hope you'll remember from last time and from some other subjects I've talked about, is that I want to deal with this subject absolutely with compassion. This is not a show and tell or an exhibition of people's lives at a time that they were suffering or struggling. this is me showing why we treasure these records and how we can preserve the stories of the people who went through these things. These people's lives and stories matter just as much as the people who appear in the other records. You know, why should these stories not also be heard and validated? And I wanted to put that into context by just saying, I've mentioned before, I have done a lot of tours in my time, and I've welcomed a lot of people into our archive centres. And one of the most touching things that was said to me on a tour, a lady who I was showing around our strong room, teared up a little bit. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said she'd just found her name in a valuation roll, which is a list of property owners and tenants of properties. And her name was in it with her husband. And she said to me, "I just feel like, you know, this has validated my life. My life has been important enough to be written in a document that is kept in a big, important building like this. And that little bit of me will live forever because it will be preserved in this building." And that really touched me. I thought that was I hadn't thought of that, how much of an impact that would have on somebody. And so the mental health records, I think that's what we're doing. You know, we are preserving the stories of those people who've lived there and remembering that those lives mattered. So today I'm going to tell you 4 stories of patients and 1 story from the staffing records. Some of them are positive, upbeat stories. Some of them are hard stories to hear, but they're all very important and equally important to tell those stories. The one thing I will say is that I am not a medic. I'm sure you will appreciate that. So I will give you what I think some of the things mean, but if there's anyone there who is a mental health nurse or doctor, please feel free to chip in with some opinions. So I'm going to give you the stories of Janet McPherson, James Stewart, Margaret McKenzie, and Hector Monroe, patients, and then the story of Elizabeth Campbell and Alex Gunn, who were staff. So first of all, we're going to start with Janet McPherson. So she was born on the 17th of March 1821 at Beeloedmore, just outside Kingussie, and she was born to her parents James McPherson and Anne Campbell, and her father was a shepherd. She married a gentleman called Lachlan McPherson, who was also a shepherd, on the 23rd of December 1843, and they settled together just outside Dalwhinnie. And I think I've said previously that we have the 4 archive centres, but the records for the asylum are held in Inverness, but they cover almost the whole of the Highland area. So within that one collection, we can pull stories from different places. And Janet McPherson's story comes from just on the kind of outer southern limits of the Highland area at Dalwhinnie. Looking at the census records, we can see that Janet and her husband Lachlan lived there for many years with their children. The 1871 census shows them with their children James, Ewan and David. But on the 24th of July 1879, and again you'll remember me saying that these records have closure periods on them. There's 100 years closure on patient records from a data protection point of view. So I won't be talking about anything after 1920. So this story is from 1879. And that was the date that Janet was admitted into the Inverness, what was called at the time the Inverness District Lunatic Asylum. And she was aged 58. And the diagnosis that was given of her was melancholia. And that was a condition which often had extreme depression and sometimes came with delusions. And the reason I've picked these different stories to tell you is, again, to illustrate people coming from different backgrounds, different ages. She'd obviously had got to the age of 58 and not had any previous episodes, any previous mental health issues, but something had happened to cause her to go in at this stage. I've talked a lot through this series about cross-referencing with other record collections. And so using this records, looking at Janet McPherson's story, we cross-referenced it with the Poor Relief records. And we can see in those that her husband Lachlan contributed money to support her while she was in the asylum. So the parish would pay for the care, but he would contribute what he could. I mentioned that you could see the children's names in the census, and they also appear in these Poor Relief records. They're a wonderful resource for family historians because you can see anyone on the Poor Relief system who their family members are who could possibly contribute towards their care. And so we can see here Lachlan is listed, but also their children, and we find out that they actually had more children than we saw in the census. So there's a mention of James, Ewan and David, who we saw on the 1871 census, but also John, Archibald and Margaret. And you find out a little bit about what they're doing, what their jobs are, if they're married, a little bit more information about each person. So for example, Margaret, their daughter, she's now called Margaret Wilson. She's married at the age of 25. She already had 5 children. So as I said, for every patient, we have an admission, we have their warrant that signed them into the asylum, and then we also have case notes relating to their particular circumstances. And in the case notes for Janet McPherson, we can see that they've mentioned that her insanity is possibly connected to her great addiction to excessive tea drinking and latterly to much smoking. But there is more to her story, and I'll come to that in a second. Whenever a new patient was admitted, they always assessed whether they thought the patient was likely to be a danger to themselves or a danger to anybody else. That's part of the process as they go into the asylum. And they noted that Janet wasn't thought to be a danger to anybody else, but that she had previously had suicidal tendencies. So they were just keeping an eye on that potential. The notes on her admission described that she rapidly spoke in both Gaelic and English, interchanging, so she would speak very quickly in both languages. And she said that she had been brought up to be a witch, that she felt influenced by the devil, and that this was because of her mother's influence. So as I say, there is mention of the excessive tea drinking, but I think possibly of more relevance would be the association with the devil. And her notes show that there was no change throughout her stay. Her condition didn't really change much. So obviously there are some sad parts to that story, and one thing I find particularly touching is the reference in the poor relief records to the fact that her husband gradually reduced his contribution to her over time because he was in increasing poverty. So you see that several periods through the years, what he could afford to give to her care lessened because he was so poor himself. But despite that, I find it incredibly touching that they mention in her case notes that throughout her 15-year stay in the asylum, it was noted that her husband visited her regularly, and that every time he visited, it brought her great joy. I think that's a beautiful thing that they took the time to write into the case notes, but also, you know, I know that part of the world very well. It's 55 miles from Dalwhinnie to Inverness. And the fact that he continued to visit her regularly shows a very huge commitment to supporting her and caring for her. Janet died in the asylum in April 1894, having been there for 15 years. So quite a substantial stay in the asylum. The second story I want to tell you about is James Stewart. James Stewart was 75 years old when he went into the asylum. So we've seen someone in their 50s, now we're looking at someone in their 70s. He was single, he was a shoemaker and a labourer. And interesting, when you look through these records and the poor relief records, you'll see people in their 70s, 80s, 90s still being described as manual labourers, as agricultural labourers, you know, still doing very physical jobs. And you can imagine that once the ability to do that lessened, what an impact that would have on their life. James Stewart had been in the Easter Ross Union poorhouse for 2 years before he came into the asylum. But during his time there, he had gradually become more violent and aggressive. He had assaulted 2 of the other inmates, and he'd also assaulted the governor. And the reason for this was because he believed that they were stealing money from him. Apparently, he often walked around looking for a missing £5,000 that he had, and if he didn't get it back, he would try to set fire to things. Again, I've picked these stories because there's something really interesting about each one, and what I found fascinating about this one was that while James Stewart was in the poorhouse, he removed the lock from his door because he said that he felt too confined and shut in the poorhouse. But when he went to the asylum, he was said to be very happy. He used to sing, he used to dance merrily around the building. I just found that very interesting, that he found the poorhouse more of a constrictive atmosphere than the asylum, which I think is something we would not naturally assume. He used to sometimes say that he was going back to Tain, because where the poorhouse was, because he was going to be marrying the governor's daughter. He was 75 at this stage that he was saying that he was going back and he was going to marry the governor's daughter. So as I say, he seemed to be quite cheerful. He would sing, he would dance, but one night he had a stroke, and he spent several days in the sick ward, part of the asylum, and then after that he didn't sing and dance anymore, but there was also no more violence, so those excessives of emotion had subdued. But what's nice, if you will, about the case notes is that they say, he no longer sings and dances, but he's no longer violent, but he just dawdles about now in a very contented way, which, is no bad way to be. He did start to have a few more delusions, and he tried to leave the asylum once and was picked up by the police at the Bewley Firth. But despite this, they note in the records that he continued to be in good spirits. And then in 1898, his health started to gradually decline. He was confined to bed in 1899 and then died later that year. So that's maybe, in some ways, a fairly typical story. There's ups, there's downs, and he passed away in the asylum. The third one I wanted to tell you about was Margaret McKenzie. Now, I've tried to do a balance of men, of women, of different types of people. Margaret McKenzie's story, she was patient number 3023. Now, I'm saying that, and I'm very much aware it makes it sound like they were seen as numbers, and I absolutely don't mean that. Just, of course, from an administrative point of view, every patient had a reference number when they went into the asylum. She was a domestic servant, and she was admitted to Craigtonnane in 1894, March 1894, when she was 25 years old. So a totally different stage of life from the other two we've looked at. She had no prior attacks, and again, that's something they would always write on the case notes. Have you any previous history of a mental health difficulty or imbalance? And so it said here that she has no prior attacks, but the current attack had been lasting 4 years. So obviously the family had tried to support her, and then after 4 years had realised that they couldn't anymore. It's interesting to me that they note that her attack came on following an illness, a physical illness, while she was in service in Argyllshire. Her brother, so they would often ask family members to give information, either about the patient's history or personality. And her brother said that she had been a very clever child prior to going away, but that this illness, this physical illness when she had been in Argyllshire, had brought about a change in her. So she started to have delusions, and she was claiming that her mother had died many years ago and had left her in care of a woman next door. And in actual fact, the woman next door was her mother. Her mother, when asked to give comment, said that the daughter had become angry and was kept threatening to hit her. And this sudden anger would appear for no discernible reason. Again, if you were watching the last time we talked about the asylum, somebody commented about the fact that the word asylum has always meant safety. That's where the word comes from. So, and that I see very much in Margaret's story. So before she went into the asylum, she lived in an outhouse because she refused to go into the house that that woman, her mother, lived in. And so to her, going to the asylum was going to a place of safety. Every patient had an initial examination, which would describe their physical and mental state. And in hers, they describe her as rambling and incoherent, with frequent bursts of laughter for no obvious reason. She denied her family, so she didn't recognise the members of her family, and particularly had an issue with her brother Donald, who she described as a stranger who kept coming into the house and who was her persecutor. Within a few weeks, her condition started to improve. She was eating well, she was sleeping well, She was good-tempered and cheerful, and I think this is something which comes across very, very clearly in these records, that for some patients, being put into a routine, being given work to do, being given a purpose, being given a system to be part of was very helpful. And she was given a job in the laundry. So by the 6th of April, and she'd only been in for about 2 weeks by this point, she could identify nearly all of her relatives, apart from the brother Donald, and she was given work in the superintendent's house. And so things looked like they were very positively improving. She had a little bit of a lapse after a few months and started to have some turns of excitement and not always knowing her relatives. However, they mention in the case notes that she went to the weekly dances, and again, something I think people will not associate with an asylum in the 1800s. There was a weekly dance held at Craigdenane, and they said that she was pleasant and polite and enjoyed taking part in the dances, although they do make a note that she seemed a little bit too fond of the men. By this point, she was working in the kitchen in the asylum. And by July 1897, they note that she's well on her way to recovery. She's a splendid worker, happy and contented. She still had some delusions, but generally she was in very good health. And what I think is particularly notable is that she didn't want to leave the asylum. For her, it was a place of safety. So in the end, she stayed in for 10 years. She was discharged eventually in 1912, relieved. So when she left, she was considered to be completely healthy, and she was aged 43 by the time she left. And what I think is interesting about that is, yes, that is a very long time to spend. 10 years, of course, is a very long time, part of your life to spend in an asylum. But perhaps for her, it was the right place to spend those 10 years, because she seems to have found it a safe and secure place. I've got 2 further stories to tell you, but before I do so, just to remind you that this event is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this event. So at no point should you be subscribing to anything or giving any payment details. So the last patient I want to tell you about is called Hector Monroe, or was called Hector Monroe. Hector Monroe they note he was about 21 when he was admitted to the asylum. So they didn't know for sure. And he was admitted in 1864 in June, which was not long after the asylum had opened. It opened in 1864, so very early days. Statutory registration had only come in 1855, so it was only in 1855 that it became a legal requirement to register a birth, marriage, or death. So it's possible that he just didn't know how old he was when he went in. He was a shepherd, and he had come from Strath on the Isle of Skye. It's an interesting case, because the reason he was put into the asylum, or taken in by guards into the asylum, was because he had become violent during a game of putting the stone. So putting the stone is a part of a Highland Games tradition, a heavyweight event similar to shot put. So in some ways, you sort of go, why would you become, so violent at that you needed to be taken into an asylum? But what I find interesting about that is it just goes to show that anything can be a trigger. And I heard a wonderful analogy a while ago, which, if this isn't a subject you're interested in, I would advise you to look it up. And it's about how everybody has a bucket that fills up to the top, and it's how much you can only cope with a full bucket. You can't cope when it starts to overload. And so for some people, their water level will be sitting halfway down the bucket, and they've got lots of capacity for stress. But for some people, if they're operating with their bucket of water nearly at the limit, it can take a very small thing to push that over the edge. And that's what I think when I look at this story, that obviously something happened during this event that was just the last straw for him. It can take it, anything can be a trigger to be the final thing that you can cope with. Every patient who went in had the physical description taken, and I think I remember saying previously that it's in some ways a good thing if you can find an ancestor who's in these records. And I know that sounds a very odd thing to say, but you have a physical description of somebody that you would probably not get in any other place. So the physical description of Hector Monroe describes him as brown-eyed, tall and thin, with a pleasant, friendly expression. He'd never been in the asylum before, he had never had any history of mental health problems, but his brother had been. And again, that's something they would take a note of. They would say, are there any other family members? Is there anything that we might see that there's a hereditary condition? So his brother had previously been in for 1 month. He was noted as having a huge appetite, and they said that he was prone to acts of wildness and extravagance. He constantly touched things, so he would walk around touching, and dancing around people. And again, I said at the beginning, I'm not a medic, but I can see, and maybe some of the medics who I see are watching will be able to give more information on this, but I see some things that we would now start to recognise as other conditions. And these records are so fascinating because they're written at a time that we didn't know as much as we know now. And of course, we still don't know everything, but you can start to see them discovering things, working out conditions. Within 10 days of being in, the records note that Hector was gentle and pleasant, and that they expected a very speedy recovery for him. But sort of similar to the last case we looked at, within 2 weeks, something had changed and he was prone to a constant confusion of mind. And I find this absolutely fascinating because they say the reason they think he's had this constant confusion of mind is two-stranded. They say that he has been showing a lot of sympathy to another patient, and also they say that he has the irritation of a carbuncle or large boil above his eye. I find that very interesting because they're saying his change in mental state has been influenced by someone else's mental state and also by his own physical state. So they're starting to realise at this point, as they discovered more about medicine and science, that your physical health can have an impact on your mental health. So the fact that he had this carbuncle or boil above his eye was preying on his mind, was having an impact on his mental health. And also the fact that the association of being with someone else who was having problems was having an impact on him. And they see both of those strands as impacting his mental health. These things both led to a lack of sleep, and he would pace up and down, pressing his hands to his forehead as if he was trying to stop hearing something. And as I'm sure we all know, sleep is so important. As one of my colleagues said a while ago, sleep is everything. If you can't sleep, everything becomes much harder to handle. And we see that in these records. Over the next 6 months, his health improved. He was given a liberal diet, including stimulants of dark beer, porter. So I'm not going to say that our mental health staff do all these things now. But within 6 months after admission, his symptoms subdued. He was seen to have much more strength due to a full and nutritious diet. He was able to sleep again, which was regenerating his system, making him more able to deal with things. And he was given work in the asylum, and they said that giving him work had made him most pleasant and obliging. And he was discharged, recovered, in January 1865. So he had only been in for about 6 months. And now, again, I say that knowing that's a long time, but it was obviously just enough time to correct the issues. And it's interesting to me that they gave him a full and nutritious diet. They tried to get him to rest and sleep. They tried to give him work and occupation. And again, I think, as I say, I'm not a mental health professional, but I think a lot of those things we would still see as, if you can have a good and healthy diet, if you can get sleep and rest, if you can give yourself occupations, then those things are still seen to be a positive influence. So finally, and I'm aware it's 11:30, but finally, just to tell you very quickly the story from the staffing records. And this was a request. I think it was Lindsay, if I remember correctly, had asked to hear something about the staffing records. So we hold a lot of staffing records for Craigtonnane. I'm seeing people coming up saying they trained there. So we hold establishment registers that talk about all the staff. We hold records that tell about rules and restrictions for the different departments. All of the different departments had very strict requirements and rules. So every category was given a very clear set of instructions and rules. An example is that the attendants were made responsible for the furniture and clothing. They had to take regular inventories and report them. And at any moment, a member of the senior staff could say, how many chairs do we have? They would have to be able to answer straight away. Make sure that nothing had been stolen or gone missing. The nurses, this is an interesting one. So it said that the requirement for the nurses that they had to be healthy, they had to be physically strong, they had to be intelligent, they had to be able to read and write. And what I find very interesting is it says knowledge of dressmaking or music will be regarded as a recommendation. Interesting. They were given a 3-month trial. So attendants and nurses were given a 3-month trial. If they were found to be satisfactory at the end of their 3-month trial, and if they wanted to stay, then they would sign a letter of engagement and do their 2-year nursing training. And in June 1919, Elizabeth Ann Campbell, who was 18, which is quite unusual because usually they had to be aged 20, but she was aged 18 and she was from Wick, and she joined the staff as a probationer. She completed her probationary training, and again we have those records, and she was entered onto the establishment register, which is the list of all the staff working in the asylum. She had an annual salary of £30 per annum, plus her board, her lodgings, and her uniform. So altogether, when you took in those other parts of that, her total salary came to £62.10 per year. So as I said, she started in 1919, but she didn't stay very long. She completed her training, but she resigned in February 1922. And she noted in her letter, which we have, her letter of resignation, she noted that this was due to her forthcoming marriage. We then had a little look at the records and found that on the same day, the attendant Alexander Gunn also handed in his notice due to his forthcoming marriage. And so we had a look through the statutory entries and discovered that they indeed married each other. They married on the 16th of March 1922 at Arden House on Anfield Road, which is in Inverness. And then records show that shortly after that, they emigrated to Australia together. I just find that a nice story that, we associate the asylum sometimes with negative stories, with negative feelings, but actually we've heard there that there's some positive patient stories, and also that there are love stories that were born out of this asylum, and that marriage was created from 2 people who worked together in that building. I hope that's been of interest. I hope you've been interested in hearing about some of those stories. I certainly hope that you know that I try to talk about them in a compassionate and sympathetic way. This is not a showcase of people's misery. Keeping these records, and I say there is an extensive and fascinating collection that we hold on behalf of NHS Highland, keeping these records allows us to learn, it allows us to develop, it allows us to understand our past, and it allows our health services to see where they've come from and where they're going. And you can see the development of healthcare, mental, physical treatment. You can see how we've learnt about these illnesses, and we've learnt things that work and things that don't work. And as I say, it allows us to treasure the memories of those people who appear in those records. Their lives are every bit as important as anybody else's. Thank you for watching, and thank you for all your messages saying you've enjoyed it. I'm really, really glad. Again, if you want to watch any of the other sessions, please do go and have a look at the High Life Highland YouTube channel. There's all previous sessions are on there, and these will all continue to be uploaded onto there. A reminder that these are brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in any of the Learn with Lorna sessions. If you are in a position to be able to donate towards our work and help us to preserve these records and tell these stories and continue to share these lives and these stories, then we would very, very much appreciate that. I hope you can join me next week. We'll be looking at the Napier Commission and crofters and cotters, and then that's me at the end of this run of Learn With Lorna's, but I will be in the next few days scheduling a whole series more, so have a look for those. There'll be a lot more coming up. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm really glad you have enjoyed it.